A warm welcome to Diplomatic Channel. I'm Layo Olarinde. Here's what's coming up on the program. U.S. President Donald Trump signs an avalanche of executive orders as he begins a non-consecutive second term in office. And South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa admits the ruling party, the African National Congress ANC, is facing an existential crisis and must urgently renew itself to remain relevant in the polity. But before that, let's check other top stories in diplomatic circles.
Kenya's cabinet has announced new measures to simplify travel for African nationals, exempting most countries on the continent from the Electronic Travel Authorization (ETA) requirement. Under the revised policy, visitors from most African countries will be permitted to stay in Kenya for up to 2 months without needing prior authorization. ETA would be dropped for all African countries except Somalia and Libya due to security concerns. East African Community nationals, which include Uganda, Tanzania, Rwanda and Burundi, however, will continue to enjoy a 6-month stay in line with the EAC's free movement protocols. Kenya also says it will introduce an enhanced process allowing travelers to receive approval instantly with a maximum processing time of 72 hours. The introduction of the Electronic Travel Authorization is part of efforts to support open skies policies, promote tourism growth, regional integration, and ease travel across the continent. New Zealand has relaxed its visa requirements to allow tourists to work remotely while visiting the country in an effort to boost its tourism sector. Under the new rules, visitors can carry out remote working for a foreign employer while holidaying in the country for up to 90 days, after which they could face possible tax implications. The government says the move is aimed at making New Zealand more attractive to digital nomads, referring to people who travel while working remotely. The new rule applies to all visitor visas, including tourists and people visiting family, partners, and guardians on longer-term visas. Only remote work based overseas is allowed. Visitors whose employment required them to be in the country still have to obtain the appropriate visas. Chinese President Xi Jinping and his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin had a video call hours after Donald Trump was sworn in last Monday, pledging to take their relationship to greater heights despite external pressure. Xi called on Putin to continue deepening strategic coordination, firming up mutual support, and safeguarding legitimate interests. The call lasted about 1.5 hours, during which Putin and Xi also discussed the situations in the Middle East, South Korea, and Taiwan. Trump had threatened tariffs on Beijing, calling it an abuser, and warned that big trouble will come for Moscow if he does not strike a deal to end the war in Ukraine. Beijing has been accused of building up Moscow's war machine by providing it with critical components for the conflict in Ukraine. Trade between both countries reached a record $250 billion in 2023, up more than 64% since 2021, before Russia invaded Ukraine. According to Russian Foreign Affairs advisor Yuri Ushakov, Putin and Xi confirmed readiness to build relations with the US on a mutually beneficial and respectful basis. A looming trade war between the US and Colombia appears to have been averted after the Colombian government agreed to allow US military flights carrying deported migrants to land in the Andean country. Arguments began when President Gustavo Petro refused to grant landing permits to 2 military planes carrying Colombian deportees from the US. The Trump administration responded by threatening to impose punitive tariffs on Colombian exports to the US. The row marked a low point in relations between both countries, which historically have been allies and cooperated closely in the fight against drug trafficking, with the US providing billions of dollars in military aid and training to Colombia's security forces. However, there seems to be light in the tunnel as the White House hails the agreement with Colombia as a victory for President Trump's hardline approach to issues.
US President Donald Trump has signed a flurry of executive orders as he begins his non-consecutive second term in office. His first full day in office focused mostly on domestic issues, such as diversity policies in the federal workforce, where he ordered all federal employees in diversity, equity, and inclusion roles be placed on paid leave. The others include tackling the definition of birthright citizenship in America and declaring illegal immigration at the U.S. border a national emergency. The Trump administration has expanded the process to swiftly deport undocumented immigrants who cannot prove they have lived in the U.S. continuously for 2 years or more. Months before his inauguration, President Trump began declaring his intention to reassert U.S. control over the Panama Canal. The Panama has now filed a formal complaint with the UN regarding U.S. President Donald Trump's threat to take control of the Panama Canal. Panama's president, however, says his country has administered the canal responsibly for world trade, including for the U.S. Also on President Trump's first day back in the White House, he signed the executive order withdrawing the U.S. from the World Health Organization for the second time in less than 5 years, a move many scientists fear could roll back decades-long gains made in fighting diseases like AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis. Delivering one of his major speeches to global business and political leaders virtually at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, he maintained his America First stance. President Donald Trump speeds through his campaign promises and what he has already done to keep them in his first week in office. He also mentions getting out of the Paris Climate Agreement, suspending international aid, and freezing federal hiring, amongst others. Joining us now is Ambassador Usman Sarki. He is the former Deputy Permanent Representative of Nigeria to the United Nations, New York. Thank you so much and welcome to Diplomatic Channel, Ambassador.
Thank you very much, Madam. It's a pleasure to join you this evening. Thank you.
Well, let me begin by asking you your thoughts on the major takeaways from U.S. President Donald Trump's inaugural speech on Monday, January 20.
Yes, thank you very much. I think, it's a presidential speech crafted in his own image, I should say, which is unapologetic, very assertive, centered and directed at his person, his opinions, and his objectives. It did not allow or give room for forgiveness, for instance, accommodation, or even understanding of the viewpoint of other parties, other constituencies in the United States and on the global arena. It was an assertion, an emphatic assertion of the Trumpian view of the world and of his country. And I think that is as it should be, because he has made his position very clear in 2016 and throughout his tenure, that he is centering his government, his administration on America, America first. And it's no surprise that his speech did not deviate from that philosophy, that dogma, very markedly. So the takeaways from the speech is, number one, immigration is top priority. And as we have seen by the flurry of executive orders that he has signed, immigration or stemming immigration actually from Latin America is a cause célèbre with him. Secondly, environment. The environment and climate change, he did not believe in that. And I think, the measure so far he has taken is to reverse America's position, both nationally and internationally, in terms of exploiting fossil fuels, opening up opportunities for diesel, gas, and other sources of energy and nuclear energy, and also really removing restrictions on the energy sector, according to him, to free up that sector. The other issue, of course, is what he called the weaponization of justice in America, which really translates into supposedly the witch hunting of himself and his supporters after the so-called insurrection of June 6, 2020. So it is a clear establishment of his priorities and unapologetic demonstration of his capacity to project his mind onto the American governance scene and also into the global situation, whereby, for instance, he says he will bring to an end the war between Russia and Ukraine, and also lifting of sanctions against militant settlers who are actually attacking innocent and unarmed Palestinians. So all these things indicate the trend of his administration.
Yeah,
As
Ambassador,
far as Nigeria is concerned,
hampering on your comments just right now on, the Russia-Ukraine war, he's urging Russia's President Vladimir Putin to make a deal, to come to the negotiating table. We've seen him ask of that, and he calls the war a ridiculous war. If Russia doesn't do this, he says it's going to face new tariffs and sanctions. Do you see Trump carrying out this threat? That's, if Russia doesn't come to the negotiating table.
well, whatever he will do, he has to take into consideration the global arena. That is the conjunction of forces between the allies, that is NATO, EU, and their allies, and the United States of America. Here, he doesn't have too much room for maneuver, especially going it alone to seek a settlement between Russia and Ukraine. He has to, perforce, carry on board partners like Great Britain, France, Germany, and other countries of the EU and the NATO alliance. And also the European Union government administration also has to be taken on board because they are stakeholders in the current confrontation between Ukraine and Russia. That said, I think he wants to leverage a special relationship that he wants to establish or that he had established previously with the Russian leader, Mr. Vladimir Putin, in order to prevail on him to draw back, to pull back, and seek some sort of peaceful resolution of the conflict with Ukraine. Mind you, he is very concerned about the introduction of so-called foreign forces into the arena, into the theater of war, particularly North Korean troops, thousands of them fighting on the side of Russia. When this conflict escalates, as people fear it will, into uh, non really, what do we call it, conventional weapons, then we are now looking at the option of nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction. North Korea's arsenal may be called to serve Russia's interests or Russia's side on that war. And I think the Americans and Europeans cannot afford that. So these are very critical geopolitical and strategic considerations going on in the
Indeed.
termination of the war in Ukraine.
Ambassador, let's talk about relationship between the U.S. and the world at large. Well, for his inauguration, we saw President Trump break tradition by inviting world leaders from countries including China, Italy, and Argentina. But we could see that there were no African heads of state at that ceremony. No African head of state was invited. What does this mean, or what does this tell us? What does this mean concerning US and Africa relations?
Well, this is indicative of the mindset and the personal relationships that he has established with other leaders. It is, I think, to my mind, an indication of the absence of personal rapport or relationship between himself and African leaders. And even if there are, or there were, they may not really feature so prominently to the point of inviting them to the inauguration that was held, his own inauguration. What really matters, or people who are observing the scene were really surprised at, was actually the invitation of any foreign leader. It is not the convention or the tradition in US for foreign leaders to be invited to presidential inauguration, but he did. And those he invited really politically are of his own ideology, of his own image, of his own type. I think it's just image making for the
All right.
right-wing political leaders. We shouldn't be worried or concerned about it. I think Africa's importance should not be judged by the invitation of another country's leader outside Africa to certain functions. Whether they invite us or not, it shouldn't make any great difference in terms of our own estimation of ourselves.
All right, then. Thank you so much, Ambassador Usman Sarki, former Deputy Permanent Representative of Nigeria to the United Nations. Thank you for your thoughts on Diplomatic Channel.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure. Thank you.
South Africa's ruling party, the African National Congress, is at a crossroad. President Cyril Ramaphosa has admitted the party is facing a crisis and must urgently renew itself to remain relevant in the polity. This call for renewal follows the ANC's historic defeat in the May 2024 elections, which led to the formation of a government of national unity. The president has pointed to the state of the economy and unemployment as key factors behind the party's electoral decline. Let's discuss this further. Joining us now is political analyst Gabriel Krauser from Cape Town in South Africa. Welcome to Diplomatic Channel.
Thank you. Greetings.
What do you think were the key factors responsible for ANC's electoral decline? I mean, how has the state of the economy and unemployment played into this?
Yeah, I think that is exactly right. The South African Institute of Race Relations, of which I'm a fellow, has commissioned polling from random groups of people using the best statistical scientific methods for over a decade. And every time unemployment comes back as the biggest problem in South Africa, we have the highest official unemployment rate on average in the world over the last decade of any country that is not at war. And I think that a lot of people quite rightly see that while the ANC did really great work in the 90s and the 2000s under Nelson Mandela and Thabo Mbeki, it started to go astray, both in terms of its policy and in terms of its personnel. So there were individuals that were corrupt, but there were also laws, regulations, rules of the road, red tape that was getting in the way of business. And together that had the combined effect of really keeping millions and millions of people out of work. And for a brief sense of how bad it is, most men, I'm a man of 35 years old, most men my age or younger, 60% do not have jobs. Over 1.5 million have definitely never had a job, and that number climbs every time Stats SA, the official government body, comes back with new statistics. So as long as that's the case, as long as unemployment is as bad as it is, I think the ANC's popularity is going to continue to decline.
Do you see the formation of the Government of National Unity signaling perhaps a permanent shift in South Africa's political landscape? And can the ANC be able to regain its dominance in South Africa?
I think that, in a sense, probably the shift is permanent. The kind of system that we have, proportional representation system, about 2/3 of the democracies of the world have that kind of system. And practically none of them have a single party that's got a majority. So countries where there's a kind of outright majority tend to be two-party states with the first past the post system. It's all very technical, but we know these countries like America. Whereas countries like South Africa, it's Germany, the UK, sorry, not the UK, Germany, Israel, they tend to have minority parties getting together in coalitions in order to govern. That's unlikely to change. There is one scenario in which the ANC does regain its majority in 2029, and that would be if it reunites with Mkhonto weSizwe and the Economic Freedom Fighters, both of which, are led by people, Jacob Zuma and Julius Malema, who used to be part of the ANC and who might be eager to rejoin the ANC if they see that as a way to further their own political ambitions.
Now, during the 113th ANC anniversary, President Ramaphosa talked about renewal. Help us understand, what does this word renewal mean in practical terms for the ANC? Perhaps the party should be worried for its future?
I think it's highly unlikely. Although, as I say, in that kind of scenario, it's possible. I think that what is most likely is that the ANC will remain a minority party, and it is likely to be part of the governing coalition for the next decade. But that is not inevitable either. It's also possible, if you look at the rate of decline that the ANC has undergone, it would peaked at 69% in 2000 and in the late 2000s, and now about 20 years later, it is down to 40%. And the rate at which it's falling is getting faster and faster. So if it keeps falling at that rate, next time it should be down to 20%. And then coalition partners could get together and govern South Africa without the ANC. I'm thinking of the DA, the IFP, traditionally Zulu party that's been more business friendly, the ACDP, a very Christian party, the Freedom Front Plus, which sort of has dedicated a lot of its energy to farmers and of the Afrikaans language. These kinds of minority parties could band together and exclude the ANC if it is unable to reverse the decline in popularity that it has undergone over the last 15, 20 years. I think that there are three aspects to it. The first aspect, which I think most South Africans are saliently aware of, is how it changes basic service delivery in partnership with its governing parties, particularly the DA. So electricity has been a huge issue in South Africa. We had these rolling blackouts called load shedding that started in 2008, but they really got very bad from about 2017, 2018. And for days in a row, some places were having no electricity, and every day the lights would be off for 6 hours at a time, or 6 hours over the course of the day for most of the country. That ground businesses further to a halt, and it still places a kind of cap on South Africa's growth potential. But what has happened is that load shedding has largely been reversed. Partly that's because just businesses have run away, and so there's less demand, but partly it's been through smart interventions, through allowing private investors to set up their own mass solar panel battery complexes, through tax incentives to drive businesses to go off-grid and so on. And if more of that is done, if more of that kind of invitation to the private sector to participate is actually implemented, then that is going to improve lives and livelihoods, and people will feel it. The second aspect of the ANC's challenge in the next renewal phase, if it does it, is personnel. It needs to put people behind bars that have prima facie evidence of corruption leveled against them, particularly at the State Capture Report, which was chaired by our former Chief Justice. So it was as serious as a thing could be, but really they've been practically zero high-level arrests as a result of thousands and thousands of pages of evidence that was given forward. It just went nowhere. That has to change to send a message to the people that are still in government. Look, you can keep your job, but only if you change your ways, become honest, and whistleblow on those who don't come to this renewal party. The third thing is to think about policies. Our strong recommendation is that the ANC abandons its BEE policy, which kind of tries to carve up the country by race, and instead goes for a growth policy. We think that'll be much better for poor Black South Africans. Black people are overwhelming the majority of poor South Africans, but they're the ones suffering the hardest from this no growth business environment. The same is also, however, true of black dollar millionaires and even billionaires. If we just put race aside for a minute and focus on merit, focus on who can really do the job rather than who's best friends with the particular government official. I think South Africa's growth potential is huge. We still have the deepest financial markets in the continent. We've got very sophisticated infrastructure, good trade connections on the continent and with the rest of the world. And we have really turned the corner racially in the sense that most wealth is, according to Statsa, the official government body, in the hands of Black people. And if you look at the top 5%, it is now a minority that are white, which makes sense because white people are a minority. Obviously, they were in charge of all of the money from apartheid, but that historical trend has changed. And we think that the policy must now change with it, unlock the potential for growth, allow international investors. You know, if you're a foreigner from Africa, you don't count as Black in South Africa, and then you get excluded by the BEE laws. It's a very foolish system that we have that just chases away money. We need to stop chasing away money. We need to let business in. We need to let money in. Money makes things that make jobs, that make people happy, that people want to spend on. So we think that's the direction that the ANC needs to focus on. If they do that, personnel, policy, and real service delivery improvement, their prospects for staying in power for the next generation are extremely strong.
Well, thank you so much, Gabriel Krauser, political analyst, joining us from Cape Town. Thank you for your time on Diplomatic Channel.
Thank you.
And that's Diplomatic Channel this week. You can catch this and other episodes again on youtube.com/channelsweb. I'm Layo Olarinde. Thank you for watching.